Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of Dr. Greg Drinkwater's mini course on Jewish countercultures. Tonight, you will hear a lecture and be able to participate in, again, the last part of the course. And this tonight is called Queer Judaism, LGBTQ Jews Reinventing Jewish Traditions. So really focusing on the ways in which, and he already suggested at the beginning that the counterculture becomes part of the culture itself. You know the ground rules, but I'll repeat them anyway, which is in the webinar format, all of you are muted. If you want to ask a question, and we welcome those, please put them in the chat, and I will moderate the chat at the end of the session. So again, it's a good opportunity if you want to revisit perhaps some earlier material and how it links up with tonight's material, that's fine as well. The mini course, as you know, is being recorded, and in fact, I'm going to put on the live audio transcription. So that's live too, and will be posted, as are the other sessions, on the Bildner Center website. So please avail yourself of that if you know someone who couldn't come tonight. So I'm going to welcome again Dr. Greg Drinkwater, the Reitman Visiting Scholar here at the Bildner Center this spring, to teach us about queer Jews and the way in which they interacted with Judaism and reinvented the tradition. Thank you so much.
So I want to start off just by thanking once again Professor Sinkoff for making this happen, for hosting these sessions, and of course the Bildner Center for everything involved with bringing me to all of you and to Rutgers. And lastly, to the Reitman family for their support in making all of this possible. So today is our last session, and I'm going to dive right in. And let me get my screen shared. So just bear with me for one moment. All right, so we are now going to deal with, as Professor Sinkoff said, queer Judaism, and engaging with how LGBTQ Jews, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer Jews have engaged with reinventing Jewish tradition. So I'm going to start off though by just a couple loose ends from last time, as I did the last couple times. First, we closed last time with a brief look at the Jewish Liberation Project, and Aviva Cantor, one of the core founders of the Jewish Liberation Project, photographed there. And one of the Jewish Liberation Project's main purposes was to promote a radical vision of Zionism, a radical left vision of Zionism. And Aviva Cantor and the other founders tried to create an explicitly Zionist new left politics. And they weren't really so much focused on legitimizing Israel within broader new left circles, but they were trying to bring a new left idea and new left tactics to the Jewish community. I want to clarify though, I didn't bring in the JLP in order to highlight their arguments about Israel and Zionism per se, although of course that's central to their work. That's a very different topic that would take quite a lot of time for us to unpack. Rather, I wanted to bring them in, and I shared that document with those who looked at it for last time, so that you could sort of understand their broader critique of Jewish communal life. Their Zionism, their radical Zionism, was just one component of a much deeper critique of a Jewish communal world that they found to be insufficiently Jewish in its priorities and culture. And this is sort of a theme of kind of everyone we've been dealing with in this mini course. They shared this idea of this critique of Jewish communal culture with, for example, Arthur Waskow and his Freedom Seder, or many of the key founders of the Free Soviet Jewry movement, particularly the young student activists. They also shared much in common with the founders of the Havurah movement and of Jewish Renewal. All of these people, all of these groups were rebelling in their own ways against what they perceived to be a moribund, suburban, watered down, and assimilatory Jewish American culture. And the Jewish Liberation Project, like all these other groups, responded by countering that with a loud, proud public Jewish identity, and one that demanded that Jewish communal leaders take note and step up to supporting a deepening of Jewish identity through their programs and through their philanthropic dollars. hold on. But while we're on the topic of left-wing activism around Israel and Zionism, during the Q&A last time, Professor Sinkoff briefly mentioned the 1970s group, Brera, at the end, and I just wanted to quickly talk about that without, again, going into questions and debates about Israeli politics. It's a left-wing group that was founded in 1973 after the Yom Kippur War, and it supported a two-state solution emerged out of the Jewish counterculture broadly, but specifically it was actually born out of a gathering of the leaders of the Havarab movement earlier that year. The word actually is Hebrew for alternative. It's a response to the common rejoinder in Israel from its founding forward that there is no alternative in Brera, no alternative to Israeli military strength, meaning that instead of territorial concessions or compromise with Palestinians. The organization sought to open an urgently needed conversation on the role of diaspora community in relationship to Israel, and also one that dealt with the love and respect for the people and the land of Israel, quote, this is quoting, as well as our understanding that the continuity of Jewish life in the diaspora is inextricably linked to the existence of Israel. So this is the reason why I bring this up, is because it's another version of this sort of seeing the world, the Jewish communal world of this era, as being insufficiently deep, insufficiently engaged. And in this particular flavor, as with the JLP, there seemed to be some important role that Israel and Zionism was going to play. What that looked like obviously could be debated by many different people, and this was just one vision. But they felt that it was not just advocating for Israel on behalf of Israel per se, but it was also a self-interested advocacy that was somehow about what Jewry looked like in America at that time. It represented the voices of hundreds of rabbis and prominent Jewish leaders and countless American Jews. Influential supporters overlapped with some of the folks that we've already talked about in previous sessions, such as Art Green, one of the founders of Havarat Shalom and the Havara movement in general, the feminist and historian Paula Hyman, Arthur Waskow, the man who created the Freedom Center and went on to become a key leader in Jewish renewal, actually represented Brera in talks with the PLO in late 1976. And interestingly enough, that was actually an initiative that was at the time supported by the American Jewish Congress, the National Council of Jewish Women, a number of other organizations, although it quickly shifted and became very controversial immediately after it happened. Fallout from that meeting and increasing attacks against the group by America Hana's Jewish Defense League, you see here on the left, led ultimately to the organization's demise. But it was just one of these moments where, in addition to the point I'm making about that somehow Israel was implicated in this broader rethinking of American Jewish culture, that there was also a much broader range of Jewish communal discourse on Israel that ultimately shifted over time. So while we're talking about left-wing perspectives on Israel, we can now start to do our shift toward today's main topic, queer Judaism and LGBTQ activism. And we're going to do that by looking very briefly at the small lesbian feminist activist group, Gevilde Chayes. And by small, I mean small. The list of women on the left is pretty much it. That was the group. It was founded in 1982 and provided a safe space within which the members of the group could discuss difficult topics regarding Jewish lesbian identity. And all of these women were people who were active as public intellectuals, as Jewish leaders, as feminist leaders, in issues of Jewish identity, anti-Semitism in the women's movement, lesbian identity were all very relevant in their lives at the time. The group lasted only about 2 years, but one of its main purposes was to explicitly confront anti-Semitism, particularly within the radical feminist movement, of which all these women consider themselves a part. They became sort of a support group for each other as they grappled with the interrelated issues of Jewish lesbian identity and anti-Semitism. The historian Joyce Antler, in her relatively new book, Radical Jewish Feminism, noted that the group saw value in being a collective because, as one of the members, Melanie K. Kentrovitz, of blessed memory, explained, the structure of a collective was a natural, authentic form for Jewish women because in Jewish life, quote, the community, not the individual, is the unit of solution. And then she went on to say, Judaism specifically incorporates time for each individual to make private prayer, allows for a huge range of debate and disagreement. but one isn't truly Jewish alone. One is Jewish in community with others. Problems are conceived in collective terms and likewise solutions. And that's actually what we're going to be seeing for the rest of today's talk, is how groups of LGBTQ Jews saw the need to assert and understand their Jewishness together in community. Or as Reb Zalman said, right, when we were talking in the first session about Jewish renewal, that doing Jewish is about doing togetherness, that you can't do it alone. So this theme plays out. At the time, most of the women in the group saw Israel as an authentic liberation movement of the Jewish people, and that therefore critiques and attacks on Israel within the Jewish left, or sorry, within the mainstream left, were seen as anti-Semitic by them. Of course, the discussions around that have shifted, and again, I don't want to go into the details around how we define anti-Semitism versus anti-Israel versus critiques of the Israeli government. That's a much broader topic. But at the time, they felt that there was sort of a bridge that was being sort of pushed past. Interestingly, several of the figures this group have since passed, but some of them also became quite avowedly critical of Israel, such that nowadays, I think they would actually be, some within the mainstream Jewish world would describe them as anti-Israel. Whether they would claim that identity themselves, I think, is a different question, but I think they would easily be claimed as such, despite their efforts in the early 1980s to sort of protest against what they perceived as anti-Israel rhetoric within primarily the feminist movement. So now on to the emergence of gay Jewish activism more broadly. So I'm going to step back in time to the late 1960s and the very earliest moments of the emergence of gay Jewish activism. In the 1960s, few religious gay people and hardly any Jewishly active individuals became involved with gay rights organizing publicly through what was then called the homophile movement before the emergence of the gay liberation movement after the Stonewall riots of June 1969. One individual who did, though, an openly Jewish gay leader, was Steve Ginsburg. In Los Angeles in 1966, Ginsburg, who was then a 27-year-old gay Jewish leatherman, meaning he was into the leather scene in the gay world, who worked as a landscape gardener, he founded the radical gay rights organization called PRIDE, or Personal Rights in Defense and Education. PRIDE disbanded after only a few years, but it left an important legacy for the gay civil rights movement. PRIDE was likely the first gay group to use the word pride in association with a gay civil rights agenda, and it offered a more grassroots and radical version of gay community organizing than most previous gay organizations at the time. It therefore marks a moment of transition between the respectability politics, sort of assimilationist politics of the previous homophile movement, the homophile organizations of the 1950s, 1960s, and the more radical challenge to society that drove the gay liberation movement that began in 1969 and continued through the 1970s and early 1980s. I'm actually going to take off my glasses. I find it's a little bit easier to read my text. Ginsburg, for example, often wore full leather to gay activist meetings in 1966, 1967, and he framed PRIDE as an activist militant group taking to the streets and compared it to, quote, the prissy little old ladies of some of the other groups, meaning the mainstream, again, quote unquote, homophile groups, such as the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis. These are probably groups you may not know the names of, but they began organizing in the early 1950s, and by the mid-1960s had a rather robust national network of gay activists who generally favored quiet, subtle, dignified activism. On New Year's Eve between 1966-67, undercover police beat and arrested gay patrons at the Black Cat Tavern, a gay bar in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles. And actually it's still there. It's now a restaurant. You can go see it in Silver Lake. Several patrons were seriously injured and 17 were arrested. 6 men were ultimately charged with lewd conduct. Ginsburg, inspired by the political tactics of other minority rights groups, particularly the emerging Black Power movement, and in solidarity with other marginalized communities victimized by police violence, called on Pride to respond with visible demonstrations in front of the bar. These are among the earliest angry protests over gay civil rights in American history. Protesters carried signs saying things like, "Blue fascism must go," or "Police lawlessness must be stopped." A straight Jewish civil rights attorney took on the case of the men who had been charged and actually ultimately appealed their convictions to the US Supreme Court under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. The raid, the Black Cat, and the resulting protests, organized by Ginsburg and other local activists, was one of several pivotal moments that ultimately resulted in the birth of the gay liberation movement in the late 1960s. By which I mean that we often give this narrative that the gay liberation movement emerges out of the Stonewall riots of 1969 in New York. But there already was a shift in play, and there were other, or this is just one of 5 other events, key protests and other events prior to June 1969 that are part of this shift from the more quiet homophile activism to the louder, more visible, broader surge of activism that emerged after the gay liberation movement. Within the Jewish world of the time, though, being out and gay was pretty much a non-starter. Really no one was speaking out in favor of gay civil rights. And in fact, there seemed to be a national consensus from Orthodox to Reform, Reconstructionist to conservative, that gay people were a problem. People could debate the details of how nice you should be to these poor, sad, sick individuals, how welcoming one might be to them as they suffer through their terrible torture and pain and mental illness. But that was as welcoming as it possibly got. Until, interestingly, April 1968. Rabbi Stephen B. Jacobs, a young assistant rabbi at Temple Israel of Greater Miami, gave a sermon there in April on, quote, the Jewish community and the homosexual, in which he sought to counter myths about, quote, the homosexual world. In 1968, Jacobs was then a newly ordained Reform rabbi and had just been hired at Temple Israel. And he was actually active in activism against the Vietnam War and spoke at a large anti-war rally at the University of Miami a month or so prior. There, a group of 4 young men approached him after his speech and said that they liked what they heard, and they wanted to meet with him on another date and talk a little bit more. He agreed, and when he met with them, he discovered that they were all members of the Florida chapter of one of these homophile groups, the Mattachine Society, one of the very first homosexual groups in the country. And these were the first gay people he had ever met that he was aware of. The men expressed the challenges that they faced as young gay people in the community, and Jacobs was very taken by their plight. So he spent a few weeks doing more research on homosexuality and decided it was time to prepare a sermon on the topic. In this sermon, Jacobs argued for decriminalization of homosexual behavior, which was actually at the time a relatively mainstream view among liberal Jewish leaders. They didn't necessarily like gay people, but they felt that using criminal law to attack gay people didn't seem necessarily appropriate. But he went a lot further than that. He advocated for gay people to have the basic protections of the law, which are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. He said to his congregants that, quote, ours is not to control and not to legislate, but to understand. He went on to say that, quote, the homosexual wants the basic protections of the law, which are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, including protection against unreasonable search and seizure, against violence, against blackmail, and, quote, shakedowns by police who may themselves be latent homosexuals. This was an era when police would not only raid gay bars and arrest people simply for being gay, for being in gay space, but they would also go to places where gay men in particular were known to cruise and seek out others for intimacy, and sort of strike up sort of a flirtation with someone and then arrest them for responding, right? And this was sometimes then used as a pretense to then ask for a bribe to drop the matter and not actually file the charges. Significantly, Rabbi Jacobs then shifted from civil rights language to religious language, and this is the key. Right around this point in time, some other rabbis began talking about accepting gays as a civil rights mandate. But Rabbi Jacobs already in spring 1968 is beginning to see a religious mandate. Not just that, okay, we can do this external to the Jewish world as a way to support civil rights as we do with others, but that there's something about how we have to navigate this in the Jewish world. He said that as Jews, we have to accept every human being and enrich his life. He then invoked a classic Jewish teaching that, quote, in saving one soul, it is as if we saved the whole world. He was clearly articulating that accepting and enriching the lives of homosexuals was a path to saving their souls and an obligation for committed Jews. So rabbinical statements in support of gay people that were grounded in Jewish religious teachings, not just liberal positions on civil rights of American law, gradually became more mainstream later, but this was the first one I've yet encountered. The sermon sparked threats of violence against Jacobs and was actually covered in the national Jewish press. The sermon also opened many doors. Gay and lesbian people in his congregation and their families sought him out to thank him and to discuss their own challenges. Ultimately, gay and lesbian people, as the gay liberation movement began, and the big shift of the gay liberation movement was just the size and visibility of groups. There was now widespread activism in the streets of most major US cities. So there's this coming of awareness that one could now find a community with whom to engage. So gay and lesbian Jews began realizing that they needed to form gay and lesbian congregations. And we'll turn to that in more detail in a moment. But the very first one was actually 1970, the House of David and Jonathan, founded by Rabbi Herbert Katz. It met at a traditional church in Brooklyn Heights, and it only lasted about 6 weeks, drawing 40 to 50 congregants each week. Sorry, excuse me, lost my place. Before completely shutting down for unknown reasons. There's almost no record in the archive of this congregation and almost no record of who Rabbi Herbert Katz actually was. We simply know that it existed for about 6 weeks and then basically died off. So I can't tell you what their liturgy looked like. I can't tell you who else was really involved other than a handful of names of well-known gay activists. So although it is actually the first gay and lesbian congregation in the world, I've almost told you literally everything there is to tell about it. So I'm going to now, in a moment, turn to the first gay synagogue that really has staying power. But in the meantime, other forms of gay Jewish activism were happening. So we're going to actually return briefly to Steve Ginsburg. So after founding Pride in LA in '66, Steve Ginsburg left the group 2 years later and ultimately moved to San Francisco. And in May 1972, he founded a group called Chutzpah, one of the world's earliest gay Jewish groups. He later renamed it, by the way, Achva, Hebrew for brotherhood. Ginsburg and the other gay Jewish men who joined Achva, and there were women as members as far as I can tell, conducted outreach to rabbis and other community leaders in the Jewish world of the San Francisco Bay Area. Steve Ginsburg, therefore, remains one of the few examples of a Jew who had been involved in gay civil rights activism prior to the start of the gay liberation movement, who then bridged the shift from the homophile movement of the 1950s and 60s to the liberationist ethos of the 1970s, and ultimately brought his activism directly to the Jewish communal world, one of the only people who did this. He was one of the very first gay Jewish activists who laid the foundation for the integration of gay and lesbian Jews into liberal American Judaism, at a time when most gay activists saw religion as antithetical to their activism, gay Jews not excluded. But even with organizations like Achva emerging, most gay and lesbian Jews just didn't know how to be gay and lesbian Jews, meaning they knew what it was to be gay or lesbian, and most had some experience as Jews, although a lot of them were alienated from the Jewish tradition. But putting the two together and living as open, proud gay Jews was kind of a new idea. The emergence of gay and lesbian synagogues helped create one version of a model through which people learned how to integrate these two aspects of their lives. I don't know why that text is moving like that. I couldn't make it go away, so apologies. So oddly enough, for my first slide on gay synagogues, I'm turning to a church. So on October 6, 1968, in his home in South Central Los Angeles, the Reverend Troy Perry, a gay Baptist and Pentecostal preacher who grew up as the son of the biggest bootlegger in northern Florida and started preaching at age 15, held the first service of what became the Metropolitan Community Church, or MCC, a Protestant denomination created by Perry for gay and lesbian Christians. MCC eventually grew to include member congregations in nearly every state in the US and 37 countries, becoming the largest gay institution in the world. At that very first meeting in 68, 12 men and women attended, including one gay Jew. As word spread, the congregation grew, and eventually more Jews were attending. There were really no other places for Jewish individuals to engage, so they were turning to MCC as the one place where they could be religious and gay in the same space. Out of that emerged Beth Chaim Hadashim, House of New Life, the gay synagogue in Los Angeles, and the oldest continually operating gay synagogue in the world. It was founded by a group of individuals who'd become active with MCC and eventually recognized the need to found their own organization, a gay synagogue, which they did with the blessing of Reverend Perry and also with support of key leaders within the Reform movement. And within a few short years, the idea spread to other cities. And ultimately, by the early 1980s, there were about 15 full-fledged gay synagogues and another roughly 24 smaller institutions that you could describe as somewhere between a minyan and a havara, or a gay Jewish social group that maybe had occasional religious services, but about 14 who were regularly holding services, trying to become the primary spiritual focus of the lives of their members. There's Congregation Bet Simchat Torah, founded in New York in 1973, and today the world's largest gay and lesbian synagogue. Congregation Shar Zahav, founded in San Francisco in 1977, and you see the three founders on the far right. And I might want to turn to Shar Zahav briefly. Again, you might have looked at this, maybe you didn't, but I had sent around a link to the first newsletter of both Beth Chaim Hadashim, the Los Angeles Synagogue, and Shar Zahav, the Golden Gate in Hebrew, the synagogue in San Francisco. And in there, you might have noticed that there was an essay that began with the words Breshit in the beginning. So this was the September 1977 issue of the very first newsletter of the Jewish Daily Forward, a nod to the Yiddish Daily Forward in New York, right? The Yiddish leftist newspaper. The very first issue, in which an uncredited author wrote that in the previous Jewish year, quote, "we were alone, separated and under attack." This was a reference to Anita Bryant in Florida and the anti-gay Save Our Children campaign of spring and summer 1977, which succeeded in rescinding civil rights protections for gay and lesbian people in Miami-Dade by a 2-to-1 margin in June 77. Although a few prominent rabbis and Jewish leaders supported Save Our Children and Anita Bryant, a narrow majority of Jewish voters in Florida rejected Bryant's anti-gay campaign. That highly publicized political fight was a key moment in the consolidation of a national gay political consciousness in the 1970s. But in this new Jewish year, this author continued, "We find ourselves in the midst of creation, a family, a community, a synagogue. In the past, our feelings and need for each other lay dormant. The events of the past year have made us aware that we must sleep no more. Our consciousness has been awakened. We are aware of the necessity to bind ourselves one with the other." Again, think of this community, this togetherness, right, that we already talked about with everything we've done in the last 2 weeks. Continuing, "to stand, to grow, to fight. As gay Jews, we're uniquely sensitive to the need for human rights. And at this Rosh Hashanah, we renew our dedication to the long and difficult struggle ahead as we demand justice. Most of us have been cut off from our families and our people because of our gayness. Sha'ar Zahav is a golden gate through which we pass and reclaim ourselves, our family, and our Jewishness." End of the quote. So this vision of Congregation Sha'ar Zahav as a redemptive project is the first instance in which several metaphors essential to this particular congregation's identity were first rehearsed, and metaphors like this emerged in other gay synagogues as well. But this is just a micro example that I really liked, just sort of a dense bit of text that really covers a lot of ground. Note, for example, the multiple references to family, both as families of origin, which were noted as sites of distance and rupture, and families of choice, sites of healing and growth, linked to creation, linked to wholeness. I think the Havarah movement would talk in similar language sometimes. Shar Zahav and its community was to be that new family of choice for its members, with members bound together in a form of brit, a new covenant, one with the other, restoring feelings of loss and ending a sense of isolation. Remember the opening lines. Last year we were alone, we were separated. Joining Shar Zahav and expressing one's Jewish identity through the congregation thus also conveyed a sense of Jewishness as a choice, right? All Jews becoming Jews by choice in this era, in a sense, right? Judaism is no longer simply an inheritance or an obligation. Shar Zahav was portrayed not only as a spiritually sustaining community, but it was also understood as a political project, as a vehicle for both Jewish and gay liberation. The synagogue was to represent a demand for justice, remember that word in all caps, and was to be a place in which, quote, consciousness has been awakened, and whose members will, quote, grow, and they will engage in a fight, in a long and difficult struggle, right? Political action words. In the light of the Save Our Children campaign in Florida and the wave of similar efforts it sparked nationwide, many gay and lesbian people felt under siege in the late summer of 1977. This language of struggle and fight then reflected a very real sense of a political battle for basic civil rights for gay and lesbian people, a battle in which Shar Zahav members were active participants and for which they needed the support of their new Jewish family of choice. So now I'm going to shift tactics a little bit and dive into something very specific. So I could go into a lot more detail about gay synagogues and their growth over the years, but I thought I'd actually shift a little bit and talk instead about one particular outgrowth of gay synagogues that does two important things. It shows the links between gay synagogues and the feminist movement. And we sort of did a little bit of short shrift to feminism last time, so I wanted to cover some of that. And it also shows like why gay synagogues matter. What effect did they have on the Jewish world? It gets at these questions we began with of how was the Jewish counterculture remaking American Judaism in its own image, all right? So given the visibility of the Jewish healing movement throughout the Jewish world, particularly in the US, it's difficult to remember a time before healing services and healing rituals became popular or even existed. And we all now know the Misha Barak prayer, especially the Debbie Friedman version, but it seems hard to believe that the use of a Misha Barak for healing in this way, at least in the Reform movement, only goes back 30 years. It was utterly foreign to the Reform world prior to that. The Jewish healing movement and the widespread use of the Misha Barak prayer for healing have more in common than their relatively recent origins. They also can be understood as products of Jewish feminism. They are also part of the legacy of gay and lesbian synagogues. They're also the legacy of grassroots networks of Jewish lesbians. And most importantly, they are the result and the legacy of the emotional and physical trauma of the AIDS crisis. The gay and lesbian leaders who helped create the Jewish healing movement, I'm going to turn to who those folks were in a moment, brought a sensibility grounded in both gay and lesbian and feminist communities, which emphasized communal, public, and participatory engagement with questions of gender, the body, intimacy, and the personal. This gay, lesbian, and feminist sensibility rendered visible those embodied experiences such as illness and frailty that had often been pushed to the margins within public Jewish space prior to this. So I'm going to cover this in sort of 4 different ways, and each of them will tell a piece of the story, and I'm going to try to do it relatively quickly. So the first is the legacy of women's health movement. So the Jewish healing movement built on the legacies of women's health movements of the 1960s and 70s, the politicization of health access by the Black Panthers, gay health activism of the 70s, AIDS activism of the 80s. All of these movements shared in common that they put illness into the public sphere, breaking down the barriers that had previously relegated questions of health and illness to the realm of private concerns. The healing movement is thus, the Jewish healing movement is thus part of a larger shift away from the exclusive reliance on medical authority in relationship to the body and toward more personal autonomy and responsibility for one's own body. As individuals take ownership over their healing and health, they need access to emotional and spiritual resources along with community support to sustain them, and communal contexts in which to render health and healing visible. All right, so the first sort of category, lesbian feminist innovators. So I'm going to turn now instead, though, to activism specifically linking health and ritual, not just health activism generally. Women's feminist, neo-pagan, and Jew witch circles began experimenting with healing rituals in the 1970s. Rabbi Jane Littman, a bisexual activist and among the first queer rabbis ordained by the Reconstructionist movement, remembers participating in healing rituals in the early 70s with Starhawk, the bisexual, neo-pagan, and eco-feminist activist and writer born in 1951 as Miriam Simos, granddaughter of Russian Jewish immigrants. In the context of lesbian feminist separatism, these rituals were sometimes focused on immediate physical ailments, but more often they centered around communal and spiritual healing from the wounds of misogyny, patriarchy, and gendered violence. The women in these circles did not seek or expect literal healing of physical bodies, but rather a sense of sisterhood and spiritual recovery. Rabbi Littman clarified with me in an interview that for her and for many of the Jewish women involved, neo-paganism was an experiment. Littman considered herself a rationalist skeptic, but one simultaneously drawn to mysticism and uncovering repressed women-centered spiritual practice. Littman doesn't remember exact details of these early rituals, other than maybe the laying on of hands and the use of chakra energy and aura cleansing while uttering improvised or innovative prayers in small circles. But most of the women were from Jewish backgrounds, and the majority identified as lesbian or bisexual. Littman described similar healing rituals from the more specifically Jewish context of Dyke Shabbos, a Jewish lesbian group active in Berkeley in the 1980s. In 1983, Littman joined the Jewish feminist collective Benot Esh, Daughters of Fire, a group of prominent Jewish women, and now some trans men, who have been over the years active as rabbis, scholars, writers, theologians, and if you can read the small font, there's a list of some of the individuals who've been involved in it on the screen. A number of them were either in the 80s or today identified rather as lesbians, but many were not out, and some identified as bisexual. The women at Benot Esh gatherings also experimented with healing rituals, often still largely improvising in the moment, as Rabbi Littman explained. Thinking back on these early rituals, Benot Esh member Rabbi Deborah Brin, among the first lesbians ordained as a rabbi, remembered in an interview with me that when a member of the sisterhood needed healing, the group would offer rituals similar to those in the neo-pagan circles described by Littman. Reflecting on the improvisational, it's a hard word to say, improvisational nature of these early rituals, Brin describes them as offering, quote, a free form focus on healing, more like jazz than a set piece. She tried to convey to me how radical these healing rituals were at the time. She told me that it was really unusual to bring something personal into a Jewish service in a formal way, or to give people space to simply say that they were hurting, that they were scared, that their caregivers were burning out. And she continued saying, quote, we were trying to find our way without a path in front of us. The traumas of dominance and violence against women and girls and babies. When you get a group of women talking, it's phenomenally painful. We're at the next phase, centering the Misha Barak blessing for healing is where we're going to turn to now. So traditionally, the Misha Barak for healing is a personal blessing for an ill person said when the Torah scrolls out of the Aron Kodesh at the end of a Torah service. And as I already said, it's long been jettisoned within the Reform movement. But Congregation Sha'ar Zahav, which formally affiliated Reform in 1981, but didn't accept the Gates of Prayer, Siddur, the Reform Siddur as its own, created its own liturgy inspired by the more traditional upbringing of its founding members. And in early 1985, as a response to the AIDS epidemic, then destroying their community, Sha'ar Zahav's ritual committee introduced a communal Misha Barak for healing, and they added it to Friday night services. This made Sha'ar Zahav's innovative use of the Mishaberach one of the earliest examples in the Reformed Jewish world of reintroducing a traditional healing prayer, but one not only divorced from the context of a Shabbat Torah reading, but also no longer directed toward any specific individual. Instead, it was recited for all of those in need of physical or emotional healing within the congregation or the community broadly. And there was a space always to name publicly any other individuals that people wanted to call out and thus personalize the prayer. Sha'ar Zahav, like the lesbian feminists of the 1970s, was working through its own collective traumas. Coming out as gay or lesbian in the 70s and 80s often resulted in ruptures between gay and lesbian Jews and their families and communities of origin, with the loss of expectations of marrying, of having children, of building their own families. And given this traumatic history, the Mishaberach at Sha'ar Zahav took on a dual purpose. It became an acknowledgement of immediate illness within the community, a role it still plays, but it also was a moment to recognize the collective traumas of gay and lesbian people. The traditional wording was changed to specifically mention AIDS, asking for healing for, quote, all the ill amongst us and all who have been touched by AIDS and related illness. Also, in addition to adding AIDS, Sha'ar Zahav changed the Mishaberach's entreaties for healing. In the rabbinic tradition, there's a caution against tefilat shav, or false, vain, or useless prayer. Sha'ar Zahav's rabbi, Yoel Kahn, felt that in the face of AIDS, when the disease was still largely a death sentence, the words of the traditional Mishaberach for healing were a tefilat shav, because healing in any meaningful fashion wasn't expected. Sha'ar Zahav's congregants needed to find a prayer that reflected, quote, the truth of the world in which they lived. So Rabbi Kahn broadened the language in both Hebrew and English to include spiritual healing as a messianic hope for the community. This new version brought, quote, bonds of love and caring, and the granting of, quote, courage and hope to the sick and the well. And it closed with a request for the divine spirit to reveal compassion and blessing upon, quote, all who are ill and comfort them. Let us see together a day of complete healing, a healing of body and a healing of spirit. This day of complete healing is imagined as a future redemptive moment for the entire community, not just those currently facing illness or grief. And it envisions universal healing, not the healing of any specific named body. This shift towards a messianic vision of a, quote, day of complete healing is also the same direction taken by the most famous version of the Mishaberach, the one co-written by Debbie Friedman and her then partner, Rabbi Drora Seidel. The two were sharing a home in Los Angeles from 1984 until 87, and both working in synagogues. And they also wrote the now famous blessing, they wrote the now famous blessing for B'not Esh member Marty Cohn-Spiegel, shown on the right, a groundbreaking Jewish feminist activist who did more than anyone to raise awareness around alcoholism, addiction, and domestic abuse within the Jewish community, and who had long centered trauma and healing in her own work. Her Simchat Chochmah, or Joy of Wisdom ceremony, is a celebration of eldering pioneered by the lesbian feminist scholar Savina Toibel, and you see her Simchat Chochmah on the left. Toibel held her ceremony at Beth Chaim Hadashim, the Los Angeles Gay Synagogue, in 1986 to mark her 60th birthday. Cohn-Spiegel was inspired by Toibel's example to have her own ceremony in 87. They were friends, they knew each other. And at the time, she was dealing with family illness and death and wanted a ceremony that celebrated the transition from adult to elder, while also focusing on her personal need for healing and the need for healing broadly within her community. So she asked Debbie Friedman to write a new Mishaberach for her, and Debbie Friedman agreed, turning to Rabbi Seidel for help. And as the two wrote the new blessing together, multiple contexts and goals informed their work. Through this blessing, they would affirm Cohn-Spiegel's need for her own emotional healing, but they would also be providing a Jewish source of support for others experiencing emotional and physical pain. As they considered the words to use, Friedman and Seidel thought about their own overlapping communities: feminist circles, the gay and lesbian community, the growing network of Jewish AIDS support workers, many of whom were close friends in LA, and the general Jewish world. Like Kahn at Sha'ar Zahav, Friedman and Seidel knew they could not offer a healing blessing that would be a tefilat shav, So they focused on spiritual healing and redefined Refuach Shlema as the renewal body, the renewal of spirit, and spoke of finding the courage to make our lives a blessing. Reflecting back on this in 2011, Seidel wrote that the goal was to, quote, express the empowerment of those reciting and hearing the prayer. The source of blessing is within us as well as around us, allowing us to be the active agents of our own healing. Act 3. In April 1988, Rabbi Kahn of Shar Zahav was invited by the Episcopal Church of Northern California to prepare a Jewish ritual of healing for an interfaith conference on Eastern and Western paths to healing. Although AIDS wasn't the core focus, the epidemic was very much in the air. Rabbi Kahn had no training in healing and was only vaguely aware of the feminist healing rituals I had mentioned a moment ago. So he reflected on his congregation's use of the Mishaberach and contacted friends at gay and lesbian synagogues in LA and New York for ideas. And he created a model healing liturgy that doesn't specifically mention AIDS except in the Mishaberach prayer, but was designed by Kahn to be a healing service that could be used as an AIDS service in his own synagogue. From the start of his rabbinate in 1985, Rabbi Kahn had been immersed in AIDS, with the disease eventually claiming over 80 of his very small congregation's members. There were just 201 members, by the way, when on June 2nd, 1983, its first member died of the disease, Mark Feldman, age 31. By the mid-80s, Rabbi Kahn was already providing pastoral support to a new AIDS patient every week, both from within his congregation and beyond. The congregation was attracting people from across the Bay Area and from across the country. And he began using this new model in 1988 as a healing service that he could offer weekly at Shar Zahav, and began inviting others within the community. Began attracting participants from beyond Shar Zahav. Eventually, the momentum for the services at Shar Zahav began to slow, though. And as Rabbi Kahn remembered, it sort of ran its course and people just lost interest. Many died. Outside of Shar Zahav, though, people continued to join, but Rabbi Kahn didn't really make efforts to promote it. Quote, "I was not part of any kind of healing movement," he said. "The services were very private. I wasn't an institution builder." But there were some who were. Simultaneous to Kahn's 1988 healing liturgy in San Francisco, Rabbi Nancy Flam and the other founders of the National Center for Jewish Healing began meeting around Rabbi Rachel Cowan's dining room table in New York as a response to the lack of a Jewish context for spiritual support for Rachel and her husband, Paul Cowan, as they faced his illness and eventually his death from leukemia. The women seized upon the idea of creating something that would be ultimately became the National Center for Jewish Healing. They decided to think big and act small and start now. The thinking big element was a vision for a national Jewish healing movement that would be across the country and ultimately around the world. Act Small took the form of founding in San Francisco in 1991 of the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center. Flam actually had moved there when her husband, Dr. Neil Cudler, took a residency at San Francisco General Hospital, working actually with HIV and AIDS patients largely. She connected there with Shar Zahav and realized that Rabbi Kahn was ready to move on from holding the regular healing services, so she took them over. She took over the model that he was using and began expanding it, refining it, and began offering weekly services there under the auspices of the new Bay Area Jewish Healing Center. She also began offering healing support services through San Francisco's Jewish Family Children's Service Agency and began broadening the reach of the organization. Gradually, it shifted from its core focus on AIDS and the gay and lesbian community and became sort of what we know today as the broader the broader national Jewish healing movement. But the core of the Jewish healing service that the National Jewish Healing Center was circulating in the early 1990s and late 1990s was still largely built on the infrastructure created by Rabbi Kahn. So healing circles and support groups now meet all over the US and all over the world and offer sources of community and support for Jews facing serious illness, along with their families, their friends, and their caregivers. And the Mishaberach only finally appeared in the Reform Siddur in 2007 in the new revised version of Mishkan Tefillah. Although it did become ubiquitous in Reform settings in the years before that, thanks to the popularity of Debbie Friedman's new version. Both the New Mishaberach and the healing movement have created a new capacity for a focus on the body and healing within American Judaism. It contributed to a Jewish capacity to publicly acknowledge the frailty of human bodies and to do so without judgment. Publicly naming illness and both physical and emotional brokenness allows Jews to recognize difference and frailty as fundamental to the Jewish experience. It's a recognition of difference, of brokenness, as shifting away from a presumption of wholeness, of purity and perfection. And this, I think, is one of the core legacies of gay and lesbian synagogues and the gay and lesbian Jewish movement. There are many others, but I just like sort of the specific detail of this one as a way to engage, as I said, with both feminist activism, gay synagogues, ritual, liturgy, and sort of why should we care? What difference does it make in our lives? So now I'll turn to questions, and sort of in questions we can perhaps turn to sort of a broader overview. You might have questions that go back to the other sessions or sort of bridge them back and forth. So whatever works, any questions that you have, I'm happy to take them now.
Hi, so we have a few questions, and we don't have so much time, but at least let's pose them. In your presentation today, someone asks, how do you see these innovations that you locate in gay and queer and lesbian activism with the Jewish counterculture and sort of neo-Hasidism? Are there links between them? Are there not links between them? And then the gendered piece, because the gay activism tends to be same-sex. So how would you unpack those relationships?
Yeah. So on the first piece, the sort of link to the Havarah movement and Jewish renewal, there's sort of two answers. One is that there were a few individuals who were involved in founding of gay synagogues who actually were also involved in Jewish renewal and the Havarah movement. So for example, one of the three founders of Sha'ar Zahav in San Francisco had initially become active as a gay Jew at the Aquarian Minyan in Berkeley, which was founded by Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi in 1974. And he brought actually some of what he had learned at the Aquarian Minyan to Sha'ar Zahav. So some of the practices at Sha'ar Zahav actually sort of grew out of the legacy of the Aquarian Minyan specifically. And he's not the only one, but he's sort of the one specific to a congregation we spoke about today. But as you move into the 80s and into the 90s, a lot of the practices of Jewish renewal and the Havarah movement that start to become more broadly disseminated and more mainstream within the Jewish world were quickly taken up by activists within gay and lesbian synagogues, even who might not necessarily have encountered them prior to founding these communities, but particularly Jewish lesbians who were active in feminist circles were experimenting with new forms of innovative ritual, creative feminist innovative rituals, many of which overlapped with Jewish renewal and the Havarah movement. And so there is a lot of core overlap there. And then the Jewish renewal movement was very open to gay and lesbian people and later bisexual trans people from the get-go, and officially from the mid-80s forward. The second question was, sorry, remind me of the focus.
No, just the question was just about the, and of course one has to do this, create segments.
Right.
But
so
the person was saying that the language and the practices of these innovators shares things with some, the new Jewish spirituality that you talked about in an earlier session. So it's not separate phenomenon. So another question is, it seems someone noticed that a lot of the slides that you put up are hardly official document. People would like to know, how did you find this material? I think at some point, I'm remembering that you mentioned something about Reb Zalman's own collection, but what about, it's in a historian's terms, it's very ephemeral. So someone wanted to know, how did you find this stuff and where is it?
I'm really the only person who's done sustained historical research on the topic of gay synagogues and gay Jewish activism. So I'm it. In terms of the archive, it's limited. There are some materials at the two largest Jewish archives in the country, the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, the American Jewish Historical Society in New York. Not a lot, but there is some material. And then there is some material, some of the gay archives, such as the archive at the Gay Center in Manhattan, and also the One Archives at USC in Southern California, which is the largest queer archive in the world. And they house, for example, the records of Beth Chaim Hadashim, which ultimately was donated to the One Archive. So I was able to go spend some time there. But the materials of Shar Zahav, for example, sit in a crawl space above the women's bathroom. Literally, I had to climb up on a ladder and get down on my hands and knees and crawl through this sort of attic space with a flashlight in my mouth to get at these boxes. That was as good as it gets. A lot of this other stuff is just material that people have sent me. I've done dozens of interviews and asked people, send me materials, send me what you have. Some of these photos are just from informants. So it's sort of challenging to find some of this material right now.
Now I'm sort of chiming in on this as an historian. I mean, it speaks to writing the history of people who were considered quote unquote marginal. And, this is a great challenge because what was quote marginal is no longer so marginal.
Right.
So many of the liturgical innovations that's the question I wanted to focus on, is that it strikes me in thinking about the long arc of Jewish history that today's lecture and as well as the earlier ones really point to the dynamism of the liturgy. And so many critics of Jewish culture think, if it's in the book, it's sacred, and if it's not in the book, it's not allowed. And of course, the book itself is relatively new from an historical point of view, right? The early modern period when we have the printing press. But also that the liturgy is always dynamic. It's always dynamic, and it always can incorporate new voices. So it seems to me, your point very early on that it's not a counterculture, that it becomes the culture, is something really worth thinking about. I mean, Debbie Friedman is completely normative. Shlomo Carlebach, in most synagogues, they're completely normative. The tunes that people are singing are completely normative. No one would be able to say where they're from. So the only other thing is someone had a of the moment question, which maybe you can't answer because it's not a historical question, but they saw parallels with the activism and interfaith activism of the AIDS crisis and the interfaith healing spiritual activism during COVID among Jewish clergy. It's an observation that someone made. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think clergy tend to, we tend to not really think about this because we're sort of siloed into our own particular worlds, right? But that we sort of forget that our clergy and synagogues are in partnership as professionals with their cognates in the Christian world, in the Muslim world, et cetera. And so like, they all talk, right? And they're often, they're friends, many of them. And so when they're engaging with these sort of world-defining moments, the AIDS crisis for the gay community, COVID for sort of all of us, they all talk about how they're going to engage with this spiritually. So there's that at a minimum. And then once you sort of add in the layer of political activism on top of that, many of these figures are political activists as well, and often root their activism in alliance and in sort of interfaith communal networks. So for example, the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, Congregation Shar Zahav, its building was in the heart of the Castro. Also in the heart of the Castro was the MCC chapter, Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco, a couple of blocks away. Also was a Catholic church that was predominantly gay in its membership, despite statements by the Catholic Church in the last 48 hours about what they think about gay people. But nevertheless, there are Catholic churches where the majority of members are gay. There was also a Buddhist community 2 blocks away. The point is, there were all these individuals within a few blocks of each other in San Francisco, and the leaders of these groups all talked regularly, not just the rabbi and the clergy, but the lay leaders and the active members. They all knew each other. And so they would hold joint events. They would have healing services. There were healing services that Shar Zahav jointly held at Metropolitan Community Church and vice versa. right? These things happen. They hosted jointly a visit by Adrian Rich of, the Vilde Gaius, the poet. These sorts of things are normative. And I think today I'm seeing that likewise, that many clergy are seeing the need to respond to sort of the spiritual crisis of COVID as clergy, and they turn to their colleagues because there's no reason to only think of it from a Jewish lens.
So it's a nice segue to the last question we're going to pose from the chat, which is about pushback. So I think one of the issues is that what you've detailed in these 3 weeks, not all of the innovation, but most of it has come from the more so centrist or liberal denominations of American Judaism, the Orthodox and orthopractic world, and the ultra-Orthodox practic world has been more resistant. So the question is, can you elaborate about any pushback that these new prayer groups faced from traditionalist Jewish synagogues and rabbis?
Among the gay and lesbian synagogues, certainly from the modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, not so much, because they don't see them as real, right? They don't see them as real Jews necessarily. At least what they're doing liturgically isn't necessarily real Judaism. I guess is a better way to frame it. So that is beginning to shift in the last 5 or 10 years, but for a long time, it was just sort of dismissed as this sort of other thing that we don't even need to pay attention to. What's ironic about that is that part of the reason for the richness of the liturgical innovation at gay synagogues is that many of the members and the core founders of them actually came out of conservative and Orthodox backgrounds and were deeply Jewishly knowledgeable, right? So CBST in New York especially, but Shar Zahav in San Francisco or Hadash in Chicago, there are gay synagogues all over the country. Many of the founders were people who their Jewishness was important to them because they grew up in an ortho practice, potentially Orthodox conservative world, where that was just sort of a normative part of their daily lives, and they didn't want to give that up after coming out as gay. So they had this deep-rooted Jewish knowledge, and they were able, therefore, to create new liturgy, to create new ritual out of that sort of depth of experience and that fluency in Hebrew and familiarity with Jewish prayer. Most often when I've encountered conservative and Orthodox leaders in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, before it started to become more open, who might dismiss gay synagogues, it was invariably by someone who'd never been to one. Most of the time, once they actually went to one, they may still have some issues, especially if they're Orthodox, around, what are they going to do with homosexuality and halakha, Jewish law, but they would say, wow, the authenticity of the Yiddishkeit blew them away. And I hear that over and over and over again from rabbis. Within Jewish renewal and the Havurah movement, likewise, Reb Zalman is steeped in the ultra-Orthodox world. He knows what he's talking about, as does Shlomo Carlebach, as does Art Green, like so many of these other figures. They really have the training and the skills to translate that into meaningful Jewish innovation. So, I think more of that actually has made space. Obviously, Shlomo Carlebach's melodies became for a long time normative in many Orthodox spaces, right? So I think there is room for that. The whole talk about paradigm shift and the sort of trying to kind of have a macro philosophical understanding of the nature of Jewish history, Jewish community, and Jewish prayer, like all three intertwined, maybe not so much. That's, I think less receptivity to that, but not entirely. There are other folks who have openness to that. And again, that's maybe more so in the last 10, 15 years.
Right. The world has changed, the boundaries, we know, the contemporary Jewish world it's open and closed in all kinds of complicated things.
Right.
So I want to personally thank you. I want to publicly thank you from the Bildner Center for offering our Zoom audience such interesting material. And my guess is that for those who didn't live it, this was very new. And for those who did live it, they probably haven't seen those pictures or those images in a long time. And one thing you didn't exactly talk about, this kind of performance element that comes out of the counterculture, not being afraid to be outre in all kinds of ways. and to shock. There was sort of performance shock, which is part of the political culture of the 70s and the 80s. So I want to thank you so much. And I want to thank the staff of the Bildner Center, Jenny Gurman, Managing Director Karen Small, and Yvette Gonzalez-Sato, who have made it possible, of course, to bring this to all of you. We have 2 more public programs this spring. It's amazing, but the days are longer now, so we can feel spring in the air a little bit. On April 12th, Jeffrey Chandler will be in conversation with Joshua Lambert on Jeffrey Chandler's new book, Yiddish, Biography of a Language. And that's April 12th, and on April 22nd, the musician Anthony Russell will do a performance Zoom and have conversation with the ethnomusicologist Joshua Kuhn on Anthony's very creative and integrated work on African-American and Yiddish music. So I hope you'll join us and stay tuned for all the e-blasts and the other information that comes out from the Bildner Center. And again, I want to thank Dr. Drinkwater for such a fascinating foray into relatively new history, but a little known, I think, by most people. So thank you very much. Applause.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Sure.